Hello there. This is a full, immersive story about the Holodomor, the great famine that swept across the Ukrainian countryside in the early 1930s. Over the course of this script, we will move slowly through the fields, the cottages, the markets, and the villages, seeing how daily life was lived, how hunger crept in, and how silence spread. Each part unfolds gently, carrying you through the rhythms of the land, the struggles of the people, and the echoes that still linger in memory. Before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. If you enjoy these long history stories told in a calm and restful way, please remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell so you'll know when new journeys are shared. It would also mean a lot if you leave a message in the comments telling us where in the world you're listening from. It's always wonderful to see how far these stories reach, and your voice helps this community grow. Now, take a deep breath, settle into a comfortable place, and allow yourself to relax. The story is ready to begin. Part 1: The Breadbasket of Europe. The story begins on a land that has long been praised as one of the richest and most fertile places on Earth. Ukraine, with its vast fields of deep black soil known as Chernizem, once gave rise to an abundance of grain so great that it was often called the breadbasket of Europe. For centuries, wheat and rye stretched across the horizon, shimmering in golden waves beneath the open sky. Villages were small clusters of wooden houses and thatched roofs, each surrounded by gardens, barns, and the steady rhythm of rural life. The seasons turned like clockwork, each one shaping the labor and rest of those who depended on the land. In springtime, farmers guided their plows across dark, moist fields, the soil rich and fragrant. Horses snorted in the chill morning air, their hooves pressing deep into the earth as wooden harnesses creaked against their shoulders. Families worked together, spreading seed with practiced gestures, hands moving as their fathers' and grandfathers' hands had moved before them. Children followed behind, sometimes playing, sometimes gathering stray seeds, their laughter echoing faintly across the open space. Spring rains washed over the fields, and villagers watched eagerly for the first signs of green, the small blades pushing upward as proof that life would return again. By summer, the fields rolled with life. Wheat stalks swayed in a sea of gold beneath the blazing sun. Wildflowers bloomed along the edges of the farmland, and the hum of bees filled the warm air. The days were long, and the labor often endless, yet there was comfort in the cycle. Men bent their backs to scythes, their shirts damp with sweat, while women gathered sheaves of grain and tied them neatly into bundles. Older children carried water to the workers, and younger ones played in the shade of haystacks, tumbling over each other in fits of joy. The village was alive with sound, the thud of sickles, the creak of wagon wheels, the rhythm of folk songs carried on the breeze. When autumn came, harvest festivals lit the countryside. Tables groaned with loaves of bread, pickled vegetables, and jars of honey. Families baked special braided breads to celebrate the season, each loaf carefully decorated with symbols of plenty. Candles flickered in small windows as neighbors gathered together, sharing food, music, and stories that stretched deep into the night. There was hardship, of course. Poor harvests, illnesses, harsh winters, but there was also resilience. In the Ukrainian countryside, bread was not merely food, it was a symbol of life itself, the measure of survival and abundance. To offer bread and salt to a guest was the highest gesture of welcome. To break bread at the table was to confirm bonds of trust. Winter always brought its trials. Snow blanketed the land, and winds howled across the steppe. Families huddled close around stoves, their cottages filled with the smells of wood smoke, cabbage soup, and sometimes meat if fortune allowed. It was a season of endurance when strong barns and well-stocked root cellars meant the difference between comfort and want. Yet even in the coldest months, traditions persisted. Villagers gathered for Christmas with songs, rituals, and a sense of community that kept spirits alive. Children were told folk tales by the fire, stories of heroes, tricksters, and the spirits of the land. Life continued, bound tightly to the soil and the rhythm of the seasons. For generations, the Ukrainian peasant lived close to the land, bound by necessity and faith. Churches stood in the center of villages, their domes catching the sunlight and shining like beacons across the plain. Priests blessed the harvest, marriages were celebrated with days of music and dancing, and funerals were marked by solemn processions that wound through narrow dirt roads. The cycle of life and death played out in rhythm with the cycle of the earth. To plant, to reap, to eat, to endure. This was the foundation of existence. It was a life of hardship, but also of meaning. Families passed down knowledge in the form of sayings, songs, and prayers. They learned which signs foretold rain, which winds promised frost, and which birds announced the coming of spring. A grandmother's hands showed a map of labor, the lines and calluses etched by years of kneading dough and weeding gardens. A father's boots carried the dust of countless fields, his back bent but strong. Children grew into this life slowly, their first chores small, gathering eggs, fetching water, sweeping the floor until they too took up the tools of their parents. The village was a world of its own, yet it was never fully isolated. Traders came along dirt roads with carts of goods, selling salt, cloth, or kerosene. Travelers brought stories from faraway cities. News arrived by rumor, sometimes by newspaper, more often by word of mouth. The world outside might have been vast and distant, but it always brushed against the edges of village life like the faint echo of a storm heard beyond the horizon. Bread and soil remained the center. When people prayed, they asked for good harvests. When they dreamed of a better life, it was often measured in loaves, in cattle, in barns filled with grain. The land was both a burden and a blessing, demanding endless labor, yet giving life in return. To own a field was to own survival. To lose it was to lose hope. The memory of older generations lingered in every field. The soil held the bones of ancestors, the roots of old oaks, the whispers of battles fought long ago. Ukraine had known conquerors, from Tatars to Poles to Russians, yet its villages endured, tied to the same black earth. This resilience gave people pride. Songs praised the land's richness, and poems spoke of its beauty. Even in hardship, the soil promised a kind of eternal renewal. As the early 20th century unfolded, the rhythm of life had begun to shift. Railroads stretched across the land, and grain moved faster to markets and cities. Towns grew larger, and industrial life reached further into the countryside. Yet in the villages, the scythe still swung, the ovens still glowed with bread, and families still measured their worth in the harvest. Old and new coexisted, fragile but balanced. This was the world that would soon be disrupted. For now, in this chapter, it is important to linger in the calm of what came before, to imagine the fields not as barren, but abundant, to picture the barns not as empty, but filled with sacks of grain, to hear the laughter of children in the hay, the crackle of fire in winter stoves, and the songs of mothers soothing their little ones to sleep. It is in this image of plenty, in this world of bread and soil, of family and tradition, that we must begin. For the story of the Holodomor is not only about hunger, it is also about the richness that was taken away, the cycle of life interrupted, and the silence that replaced voices once lifted in song. The Ukrainian countryside with its vast fields of gold stood as a promise of life, and it is from here in the breadbasket of Europe that our journey into the years of shadow must start. Part 2: The Call to Collectivize. The fields that had for generations belonged to families, handed down from parent to child, were about to face a new command. It came not from the soil, nor from the rhythm of the seasons, but from faraway offices in Moscow. Policies crafted by men who had never pushed a plow through Ukraine's heavy black earth would soon reach into the smallest cottages, altering the fabric of village life. They were whispered through the countryside was collectivization. To some it sounded abstract, a distant decree that might never touch their plow or their bread. To others it carried a weight of dread, for they sensed that it meant the end of the life they had always known. In the beginning, the call arrived quietly. Villagers first heard of it at local meetings where party officials read speeches and explained new orders. Posters began to appear on the walls of barns and schools, showing bright images of smiling workers in fields of wheat. The messages were simple and bold: the land should belong not to individuals but to the people, and the best way to achieve this was to join collective farms. These farms, officials said, would be more efficient, more fair, more modern. Machines would replace tired horses. Tractors would plow more land than any peasant could manage with his hands. Prosperity, they promised, would be shared by all. Yet behind the promises lay tension. The villagers listened, but they did not clap. They nodded politely, but in their hearts they feared. For to them, land was not an idea that could be redrawn with ink. It was soil they had broken with sweat and blood, earth that held their history and their hope. To give it up to a collective was to give up a piece of themselves. Meetings often took place in the local schoolhouse or village hall. Families crowded into small rooms lit by kerosene lamps, their shadows stretching across the walls. The officials spoke in firm voices, reading from papers and repeating slogans. Some villagers whispered to one another, their doubts barely audible. Others stared at the floor, unwilling to show resistance openly. Outside, the cold wind swept across the fields, carrying with it a silence heavier than any applause. At first, the call to collectivize was presented as voluntary. Villagers were told they could choose whether or not to join, but the officials were persistent. Those who joined early were praised, their names announced in speeches and newspapers. They were promised rewards, perhaps a new tool, a share of machinery, or recognition from the party. Those who hesitated began to notice the difference in tone. They were called selfish, backward, unwilling to cooperate for the common good. Neighbors who had once worked side by side found themselves divided by suspicion and doubt. The pressure grew with each passing season. Party activists went door to door, knocking on wooden frames, stepping into kitchens, and sitting at tables where bread once united guests. They spoke of progress, of equality, of the shining future that awaited all who joined the collective, but their words carried an unspoken threat. To refuse was to mark oneself as an enemy of change, perhaps even an enemy of the state. Families debated in whispers at night. Some fathers argued that resistance would only bring punishment. Better to join, to bend with the wind rather than break. Others insisted that to give up the land was to lose everything. Mothers worried for their children, knowing that hunger or exile could follow defiance. The decision tore at the bonds of trust, setting brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor. Meanwhile, the village landscape began to shift. Barns once filled with a family's grain were inspected by officials. Inventories were made. Tallies were kept. Quotas were set. Grain that had always been measured for the needs of a household was now measured for the needs of the state. Tractors did arrive, but they were few and often broken. Promises of abundance turned into lists of demands. The sound of village life changed as well. Where once there had been laughter in the fields and songs sung at harvest, there was now the heavy silence of watchfulness. Villagers learned to measure their words, to hide their feelings, to smile when they were expected to smile. In gatherings, they repeated slogans, but in private, they spoke of fear. The fire at night still crackled, but conversations often ended in silence. Even children sensed the change, their games subdued, their questions left unanswered.
There were those who joined eagerly, either convinced by the promise or eager to gain favor. They spoke loudly at meetings, criticizing neighbors who hesitated. Some believed truly in the dream of equality and progress, convinced that the new system would bring an end to poverty. Others joined to avoid suspicion, their enthusiasm a shield against accusation.
Beneath the surface, doubts remained. For the majority, the call to collectivize was a wound that deepened over time. The land was no longer theirs. Decisions about planting, harvesting, and sharing were now made by committees, not by families. Fields that once bore the marks of a farmer's personal care were now merged into vast tracts, tilled by strangers. Livestock, once cared for as part of the household, was taken into collective barns. To many, it felt as though their world had been dismantled piece by piece. And yet, life continued in appearance. People still rose at dawn, still walked into the fields, still bent their backs to labor. But the spirit of ownership, the bond between soil and soul, was fraying. The breadbasket of Europe remained fertile, but the seeds of distrust and control had been sown. At night, in cottages lit by the faint glow of embers, families sat together in uneasy silence. The bread on the table was the same, round and fragrant, but its meaning was beginning to shift. What once symbolized abundance and welcome now carried the weight of uncertainty. Every loaf baked was shadowed by the knowledge that it might not remain in the household that made it. Every field sown was shadowed by the thought that its harvest might be taken away. The call to collectivize was more than a policy. It was the opening act of a great unraveling, the moment when voices of authority began to drown out the quiet songs of the village. The slogans spoke of a brighter future, but the villagers could feel the shadow that grew at the edges of their days. They could not yet see how deep that shadow would fall. For now, they endured the meetings, the posters, the knocks on the door. They whispered their doubts, they prayed their prayers, and they clung to the rhythm of life as best they could. The soil was still rich, the wheat still golden, the bread still warm on their tables. But something fragile had begun to crack, and the silence that followed the call to collectivize was heavy with foreboding. Part 3. The Grain Requisition. The sound of boots on wooden steps became a familiar echo in many Ukrainian villages. It was not the tread of neighbors or the laughter of children returning from play, but the heavy, deliberate knock of officials arriving to count, to measure, and to take. Where once the rhythm of village life had been shaped by seasons and songs, it was now punctuated by the arrival of grain requisition squads, men carrying papers, clipboards, and the authority of the state. The grain was no longer the farmer's own. It was declared a resource of the collective, destined for cities, for export, for the needs of the state's grand plans. To the villagers, each sack of wheat represented months of sweat under the summer sun. It was bread for their tables, seed for the next year, and the promise of survival through the winter. To the officials, it was a number on a list, a quota to be met, a duty to fulfill. The process often began with a gathering. Villagers were called together in the square or the schoolhouse where party representatives read aloud the new quotas. Their words were brisk, official, and unyielding. The numbers were large, often larger than the harvest itself. Farmers shifted uneasily in their seats, their faces expressionless. Some clenched their hands beneath the benches. Others glanced at their neighbors, silently wondering how such demands could ever be met. After the meetings, the inspections began. Officials moved from house to house, barns to granaries, opening doors and lifting lids, counting every sack, every bushel. The smell of grain hung in the air, warm and earthy, mixed with the sharp tang of fear. Women stood silently in doorways, their children pressed close behind them, while men tried to explain that the harvest had been poor, that the rain had come late, that the soil had not yielded as much as expected. The officials rarely listened. They wrote their numbers, ordered the grain to be loaded, and moved on. The villagers learned quickly to hide what they could. Small caches of wheat were buried beneath floorboards, tucked into hollow trees, or hidden in earthen pits. Bread was baked quietly at night, its scent carefully masked. But searches were thorough, and neighbors were encouraged to report one another. Trust frayed. The close-knit fabric of village life unraveled further, thread by thread. The grain requisition squads traveled with wagons. Wooden wheels creaked over frozen ground, carrying away sacks that should have sustained families through winter. Each departure left behind silence, a barn emptied, a family staring at the space where their livelihood had once stood. The landscape itself seemed altered. Roads that once carried wagons full of harvest joy now carried wagons of confiscation, leaving only dust in their wake. There were moments when resistance flickered. A farmer might argue, his voice rising with desperation, or a mother might plead for mercy, holding out her thin hands. But resistance was dangerous. To refuse or to protest was to risk being labeled a kulak, an enemy of progress. The punishment for defiance could be exile, prison, or worse. And so most fell silent, their voices swallowed by the cold air. The atmosphere of the village changed with each requisition. Before, granaries had been symbols of security, barns filled with the smell of hay and the rustle of grain. Now they became sites of dread, places where officials arrived to strip away what little remained. Even the children understood. They watched from corners as strangers took away the sacks, their young eyes wide and questioning. Parents offered no answers, only a hush and a gesture to remain quiet. The quotas were unrelenting. Even when harvests were poor, even when drought or pests had damaged the fields, the numbers remained the same. To the state, shortages were not an excuse, but an accusation. If grain was missing, it was assumed to be hidden, hoarded, or stolen by the very villagers who had grown it. And so the searches became harsher, the demands more insistent. In kitchens lit by dim oil lamps, families whispered of what to do. Some suggested offering bribes, a chicken, or a jar of honey to soften the official's mood. Others spoke of hiding tools or moving sacks under cover of night. But every choice carried risk. Every whisper carried the danger of being overheard. The village, once bound by trust, lived now under a shadow of suspicion. Even as the wagons rolled away, carrying grain to distant destinations, the fields themselves stood as silent witnesses. The soil had given generously, as it always did, but the fruits of that labor no longer stayed close to the hands that tilled it. The golden fields of Ukraine, long celebrated as the breadbasket of Europe, were now feeding distant tables, leaving the local ones bare. And yet, life continued in small, stubborn ways. Mothers still baked when they could, shaping loaves with care even if the flour was thin. Fathers still rose before dawn, walking into the fields with tools that felt heavier in their hands. Children still played, though their laughter was quieter, their games subdued. The cycle of life was not yet broken, but its foundation was weakening. The grain requisition was more than the taking of food. It was the taking of security, of trust, of the bond between soil and household. It replaced abundance with uncertainty, and it replaced the songs of the harvest with silence. The villagers still looked out across fields of black earth, still saw the promise of life in the land, but they no longer knew if that promise belonged to them. At night, as the wind moved across the steppe, families sat in the glow of fading embers. They spoke little. The fire cracked, the kettle hissed softly, and the silence pressed close. Outside, the barn stood emptier than before, their doors creaking in the wind. The memory of full harvest lingered like a dream, but the reality was stark. The bread on the table was thinner, the grain store smaller, and the shadow of the next requisition loomed large. This was how the famine began, not with sudden absence, but with the steady taking away. Sack by sack, wagon by wagon, the grain left the villages, and with it, so too began the departure of the songs, the laughter, and the simple certainty that the soil's gift would be enough. Part 4: Winter Shadows. Winter came early that year. Frost crept across the windows of cottages before the last leaves had fallen from the trees. The fields, once golden with grain, lay silent under a pale blanket of snow. The wind swept across the open steppe with a mournful whistle, rattling wooden shutters and bending the bare branches of orchard trees. Life in the Ukrainian countryside had always been shaped by the harshness of winter, but this season carried with it a heavier stillness, a silence that felt different from years before. Inside the homes, families huddled close to their stoves, the warm heart of each cottage. The clay ovens glowed faintly, their fires fed with careful handfuls of wood. Every log was counted, every ember stretched as long as possible. The smell of smoke clung to clothing, hair, and blankets. The sound of crackling fire was comforting, yet it could not mask the emptiness that grew in the storerooms and barns. For generations, the coming of winter had always been met with preparation. In late autumn, families filled their cellars with jars of preserved vegetables, baskets of apples, barrels of sauerkraut, and sacks of flour. Chickens were slaughtered and their meat salted or smoked for the lean months ahead. Root vegetables were stored in cool corners, waiting to be boiled into soups that would sustain households when the snow was deep. Bread baked in December was meant to carry families until spring. This year, the barns and cellars were different. Where shelves had once been heavy with jars, many now stood bare. Where sacks of grain had once been stacked, there was only empty space. The requisitions had taken much, and what little remained had to be stretched further than ever before. Mothers measured flour with careful hands, their gestures deliberate, their eyes shadowed with worry. Fathers cut thinner slices of bread at mealtime, hoping the children would not notice. Children, though, always notice. Their questions were fewer now, their eyes searching, their silence saying more than their words. The winter sky itself seemed to carry the weight of the moment. Days were short, the light dim and gray. Snow fell steadily, covering the land in a blanket that was both beautiful and merciless. The steppe looked endless, white and cold, stretching in all directions with no sign of relief. Villagers trudged through it with heads bowed, their footprints quickly swallowed by fresh drifts. The world felt smaller, each cottage an island of warmth in a sea of frozen silence. Evenings brought a kind of weary ritual. Families gathered at the table, a single lamp flickering above them. The food laid out was modest, perhaps a thin cabbage soup, a crust of bread, a small piece of lard if fortune allowed. Hands folded, prayers were whispered, gratitude offered even for what little there was. The act of eating together became more symbolic than sustaining. It was a way of holding on to tradition, of pretending for a moment that life continued as it always had. Stories were told to fill the silence. Grandmothers spoke of winters past, when snow lay as deep as rooftops, yet the cellars had been full and the tables heavy with bread. Fathers reminded their children of harvests when the wheat had grown taller than a man's waist, when wagons rolled home laden with sacks of grain. These stories were both comfort and sorrow, for they reminded everyone of what had been lost. The songs of winter carried on, though quieter than before. Villagers still sang carols at Christmas, their voices rising into the frozen night. Small processions wound through the snow, children carrying stars on sticks, candles glowing faintly against the darkness. The traditions persisted even as hunger pressed closer. Faith became a shield, rituals a fragile defense against the emptiness creeping into homes. But the shadow of scarcity deepened as the months wore on. The first signs were subtle. Neighbors grew thinner, their faces pale, their movements slower. The marketplace, once bustling even in winter, stood nearly empty. Stalls that had displayed loaves, fish, and jars of honey now offered little more than odds and ends. Conversations were hushed, greetings shorter, laughter rare. The officials still came, though less often in the deep snow. When they did, their boots left heavy tracks leading to barns that no longer held what they sought. Their voices echoed in rooms already stripped bare. Families stood silently, knowing they had little left to lose. The act of searching had become ritual, the threat constant even when nothing remained to take. The silence of the villages grew heavier. Dogs barked less often, their ribs showing through thin fur. Children played less, their steps slower, their energy dulled. The sound of axes in the forest was constant, as men cut wood to keep their homes from freezing. The crack of falling trees echoed through the white landscape, a reminder of labor that could not be avoided even in weakness. At night, hunger whispered into dreams. Children woke and asked for food, their voices soft in the darkness. Mothers soothed them with songs, their hands stroking thin hair, their words carrying comfort even when the cupboards were bare. Fathers stared into the embers, their faces set, their silence heavy. The winter seemed endless, the horizon offering no promise of spring, and yet, amid the shadows, small sparks of resilience endured. Neighbors shared what little they could, trading jars of pickled beets for a small piece of bread, or gathering together to prepare a communal meal from scraps. A bowl of soup shared between families meant more than sustenance, it meant survival of spirit. Hope was fragile, but it was not yet extinguished. The land itself seemed to sleep beneath the snow, its richness hidden, its promise buried. The villagers knew that beneath the frozen crust lay the black earth that had always fed them. They clung to the thought that spring would come, that seeds would sprout again, that life would return to the silent fields. The memory of abundance was a comfort, even as the present felt hollow. Winter shadows pressed long across the villages that year. They fell not only across the snow, but across the hearts of those who endured it. The barns were emptier, the tables barer, the songs quieter, but the people endured as they had endured harsh winters before. They told themselves that this too would pass, that the soil would forgive, that the cycle of life would begin again. They could not yet see that the cycle was breaking, that the shadow stretching across their homes was not merely winter's work, but something deeper, more deliberate. For now, they endured the cold, the silence, and the hunger that had just begun to stir. They clung to the hope of spring, even as the long night of famine slowly approached. Part 5, Whispers of Shortage. When winter began to loosen its grip, the air softened and the snow slowly retreated, but the sense of relief that usually accompanied spring did not come as strongly as before. In other years, the thaw had been a promise, the black soil reappearing beneath melting drifts, the first shoots of green poking bravely through the ground, the smell of damp earth rising like a blessing. This season, though, the thaw revealed more than life. It revealed emptiness. The barns were light, their doors swinging open to reveal bare floors. The cellars were quiet, shelves that once held jars of preserves now echoing with hollowness. The careful reserves families had set aside for winter had been stretched beyond their limits. By the time the snow melted into rivulets and streams, many households had little left to eat. The joy of spring was muted, replaced by a gnawing unease that lingered even under the first warm rays of sun. It was in this space of quiet hunger that the whispers began to travel. A neighbor would lean close at the well, speaking low so that only one pair of ears might hear. Someone had heard that in the next village, families were already going without bread. A traveler passing through might murmur that the market in a nearby town had stood empty, the usual stalls bare. A letter smuggled from a cousin in another district carried the same troubling tale. Grain was gone, tables were thin, and no relief was in sight. At first, the villagers tried to dismiss these stories. Rumors had always passed from mouth to mouth, often growing larger with each telling. Perhaps it was only a poor harvest elsewhere, or perhaps the shortages were temporary. Perhaps the stories were exaggerated, born of fear. But as days turned into weeks, the same words reached the ears of more and more people, repeated by too many voices to ignore. The marketplace, once a center of chatter and exchange, became the stage for these whispers. Farmers who brought eggs or vegetables to trade spoke cautiously of what they had seen on the road. A wagon that should have been heavy with grain had been empty. A checkpoint had turned away travelers looking for food. Entire shipments, they said, were being carried away on trains bound not for the hungry countryside but for distant cities or foreign markets. The conversations were hushed, the speakers glancing often over their shoulders. Fear wrapped itself around these whispers, for it was dangerous to speak too openly. The officials called such talk alarmism, sabotage, even treason. To repeat a story of shortage was to risk being accused of spreading lies against the state. And yet truth pressed forward, carried in the hollow cheeks of neighbors, in the thinness of children's arms, in the emptiness of the village ovens. No decree or slogan could hide what every household could see for itself. The signs of shortage appeared in small but undeniable ways. Bread, once baked in great round loaves, became thinner, flatter, stretched with whatever ingredients could be found: potato peelings, ground acorns, even sawdust. Soups that once held cabbage, carrots, and bits of meat grew pale and watery. Market days grew quiet, with fewer stalls, fewer goods, fewer coins exchanged. Even the air of the market changed. Where once it had been filled with voices bargaining and calling out, now there was mostly silence, broken only by the occasional shuffle of feet on dusty ground. In homes, the whispers turned into nightly conversations. Parents spoke softly after their children were asleep, wondering how long their stores would last. Some families had already eaten the seed grain that was meant to be saved for planting. Others had slaughtered livestock earlier than they wished, unable to keep feeding animals when their own children were hungry. Choices that once would have seemed unthinkable became necessary. The church, once a place of comfort, also became a vessel for whispers. After services, people lingered outside, their prayers followed by quiet exchanges of news. In that village, they say the children are begging in the streets. In the town nearby, no flour is to be found at all. The bells still rang, the hymns still rose, but the words spoken in shadow carried a weight as heavy as any sermon. Even children noticed the change. They watched the adults lower their voices when certain topics arose. They saw the quick glances, the worried brows, the silences that followed simple questions. They may not have known all the words, but they understood the mood. Their games were quieter, their laughter subdued. The carefree sounds of childhood were being replaced by a strange awareness, a sense that something in their world was shifting beyond repair. The land itself mirrored the mood. Fields prepared for spring planting seemed emptier, the furrows stretching long and bare across the horizon. Fewer animals grazed in the pastures, their absence noticed by all. The orchards, once lively with birds, stood quiet. The countryside carried the stillness of a held breath. as though waiting for something unnamed but inevitable. Travelers became rare, but when they came, they brought confirmation of what the villagers already feared. A man arriving from a distant district might speak of entire households without bread. A woman passing through might weep as she told of relatives gone hungry. Each new voice layered upon the last, the whispers becoming a chorus. And yet, amid the worry, there was still the instinct to hope. Some said the shortages were temporary, that the state would soon provide relief. Others said the spring planting would restore balance, that the soil would not betray them. Hope clung like frost on the edges of windows, fragile, easily melted, but present all the same. In the evenings, families sat together, their lamps glowing dimly. The fire gave off warmth, but the conversation was marked by silence. When they did speak, it was often in fragments, in half-finished sentences. The unspoken words hung heavy in the air. What will happen if the grain does not return? What will happen if the whispers are true? The season of shortage had not yet revealed its full weight. It was still a time of rumors, of uneasy glances, of quiet speculation. But the truth was beginning to show itself, creeping in like a shadow through the cracks of cottage walls. The whispers were no longer only rumors. They were becoming reality. And though the villagers did not yet know the depth of what lay ahead, they sensed that the silence of the fields was no ordinary silence. It was the silence before a storm. Part 6. Empty Tables. The table had always been the heart of the Ukrainian household. It was where families gathered at dawn for breakfast before heading to the fields, where children sat in the glow of lamplight doing small chores or listening to stories, where bread was broken and shared in acts of hospitality that bound villages together. To sit at a table was to be part of a circle of life, a circle of food, kinship, and tradition. But now the tables began to change. The wood was the same, scarred from years of knives, bowls, and elbows polished by countless meals. Yet what was placed upon them grew thinner with each passing day. What had once been covered with steaming loaves, bowls of soup, and plates of dumplings was reduced to scraps, stretched as far as imagination allowed. The ritual of sitting together remained, but the abundance that gave the ritual meaning was fading. At first, the changes were subtle. A loaf of bread, once thick and round, was smaller, baked with less flour, mixed with husks or weeds to make it last longer. Soup grew lighter, more water than vegetable, flavored faintly with whatever roots or herbs could be found. Families told themselves it was temporary, that they would soon return to heavier meals. But as weeks stretched on, the truth could not be hidden. Children felt it first. They asked for seconds that no longer existed. They lingered at the table after meals, hoping another piece of bread might appear. Their eyes followed every movement of their parents' hands, watching as food was divided. Parents gave larger portions to the little ones, quietly taking less for themselves. Mothers stirred pots longer, as if the motion itself could create more substance. Fathers chewed slowly, drawing out each bite, their silence speaking louder than words. The conversations at the table changed as well. Where once there had been laughter and stories, there was now quiet. Words were chosen carefully, voices low, silences long. Families spoke of the day's work, of chores to be done, but rarely of the hunger that sat among them. To name it too clearly was to give it more power. So it remained an unspoken guest, seated beside them at every meal, silent but ever present. The sounds of eating became louder in the absence of conversation. The scrape of spoons against wooden bowls, the crunch of crusts, the slurp of thin broth. These noises, once ordinary, now seemed to echo. Each sound reminded them of what was missing, the heavy clatter of full plates, the laughter of children too busy chewing to be quiet. Now the meals ended quickly, the table cleared of its few offerings, and the silence returned. Markets offered little relief. Stalls once busy with produce, fish, and baked goods now displayed mostly emptiness. A few traders appeared, selling what scraps they had for high prices. Families walked the dusty lanes between stalls with hope in their eyes, but most returned home with little or nothing. The ritual of market day became another reminder of scarcity, the bustling conversations replaced by quiet footsteps and hollow stares. Some families resorted to desperate measures. They ground acorns into coarse flour, boiled weeds into bitter stews, and scraped the last bits of fat from cooking pots to flavor their meals. Bread baked from such mixtures was hard and dark, crumbling at the touch. Yet it was still bread, and to place even this upon the table was an act of love. Mothers often apologized as they served, though no one blamed them. Fathers bowed their heads and gave thanks, though their prayers carried the heaviness of worry. The emptiness of tables extended beyond food. Hospitality, once central to village life, was harder to uphold. In better years, no guest left a house without being offered bread and salt, a piece of cheese, or a bowl of soup. Now, when a knock came at the door, families hesitated. The desire to welcome clashed with the fear of sharing what little remained. Neighbors still visited one another, but their visits were shorter, their conversations quieter, their gestures of welcome strained by hunger. The children adapted in their own ways. They began to play at markets, pretending to sell imaginary loaves and jars, trading pebbles for pretend bread. Some sang songs about food, their voices wistful but playful, not fully understanding the weight of their games. Their innocence softened the edges of hardship, yet their thinness betrayed the truth. The empty table was reflected in their faces, their cheeks less full, their laughter less frequent. Even the animals felt the change. Chickens wandered hungrily, pecking at the bare ground. Dogs, once fed scraps from the table, grew thinner, their ribs visible beneath matted fur. The household table, once the center of nourishment for both people and animals, could no longer provide enough for all. The harmony of the household where humans and animals lived side by side began to fray. At night, when the day's work was done and the table cleared, the silence lingered. Families sat together by the stove, some sewing, some mending tools, some simply staring into the fire. The memory of full meals lingered like a ghost. The smell of baked bread haunted their dreams, the warmth of abundance remembered but not present. Yet, amid the emptiness, the ritual endured. Families still sat at the table together, still folded their hands in prayer, still shared what little there was. The act of gathering itself became a quiet form of resistance, a way of holding on to dignity. The table, though bare, was still sacred ground. It reminded them that they were together, even as hunger pressed harder with each passing day. The emptiness of the tables marked the shift from whispers of shortage to the reality of famine. No longer only a rumor carried from distant villages, it was now present in every household. The absence was visible, tangible, undeniable. The table, once a place of abundance, now bore the weight of scarcity. And though families still hoped for relief, the silence that gathered around the empty plates spoke louder than any words. Part 7. Life in the Collective. The dawn still came early in the villages, painting the sky with soft streaks of gray before the sun rose. Men and women still rose from their beds, pulled on worn boots, and stepped into the cold air to begin their day's labor. The fields stretched endlessly, as they always had, the black earth waiting for the press of plow and foot. Yet the meaning of this work had changed. Where once each step into the soil was part of a family's survival, now it was done for the collective. The collective farm was meant to be the pride of a new order. Officials had promised that it would bring prosperity, that machines would lighten the burden, that no household would go hungry again. Bright posters still hung on the walls of schools and barns, painted with images of smiling workers beside gleaming tractors, grain pouring in golden streams into endless silos. But the reality that unfolded in the fields was far quieter and far more bitter. The days of labor began as they always had. Workers gathered in groups, walking along paths lined with frost or mud, their tools slung across their shoulders. Horses still pulled plows, though many were thin from lack of fodder. Men bent their backs to the earth, women sowed seeds with careful hands, children carried water or gathered weeds. The rhythm of agricultural life persisted, but it carried a hollowness. For the fields no longer belonged to the families who worked them. The grain they planted and harvested no longer filled their barns. It was measured, tallied, and sent away, leaving little behind.
The collective blurred the lines of ownership. Cows that once belonged to households were herded into communal barns. Chickens and pigs were taken as state property. Tools and carts were gathered together, borrowed and shared as needed. Villagers still tended the animals, still repaired the tools, still guided the plows, but the bond between effort and reward was broken. The labor remained heavy, yet the fruit of that labor slipped further from their grasp. Work on the collective farm was organized by brigades. Each group had its assigned field, its tasks for the day. There was little room for choice. The overseers kept watch, their eyes sharp, their notebooks ready to mark those who worked too slowly or complained too loudly. People learned to keep their heads down, to push the plow, to pull the weeds, to bend silently to the rhythm of labor. The songs that once accompanied harvests faded. The fields were quieter now, filled with the sound of strained breath and creaking harnesses, but not with music. And yet the soil gave itself as it always had. The seeds sprouted, the plants grew, and the fields shimmered once again with stalks of grain. To see the wheat rising was both comfort and sorrow. The villagers had coaxed life from the earth with their own hands, yet they knew the harvest would not fill their cupboards. The grain would be counted, taken, carried away in wagons and trains, leaving them to face another winter with little to show for their toil. In the evenings, the workers returned home, their bodies weary, their clothes damp with sweat and dust. The path from the fields to the cottages was quiet, each step heavy with exhaustion. Inside, the tables still stood bare. The contradiction was sharp, full fields outside, empty bowls within. Fathers came home with aching backs, only to find thin soup waiting. Mothers returned from weeding fields, only to ration a crust of bread among their children. The children, too, joined the labor, gathering sticks, herding animals, carrying water. Their small hands were calloused earlier than they should have been. The collective farm brought with it a new kind of surveillance. Officials visited often not only to measure grain, but to measure loyalty. They asked questions, wrote reports, and sometimes gathered villagers for lectures about progress and duty. The words were lofty, but the reality was harder. Those who spoke against the collective risked being branded enemies. Families learned to nod, to repeat the slogans, to keep their true feelings hidden behind polite expressions. Still, life found ways to persist in small corners. Women kept tiny gardens behind their cottages, growing onions, potatoes, or herbs where they could. These small plots, though modest, became lifelines. Children foraged along the edges of fields, gathering berries, mushrooms, or wild greens to bring home. Even the smallest harvest from a hidden garden or a foraged patch of forest was cherished, added to the pot with gratitude. Animals, too, played their part in survival. A single goat might provide milk for a family, hidden from the notice of officials. A few chickens, if not confiscated, might offer eggs. These small mercies were guarded carefully, spoken of only in whispers, for to be discovered could mean losing them altogether. The rhythm of labor continued through the seasons. Spring planting, summer tending, autumn harvest, each step performed with diligence, though the rewards slipped away.
The pride once felt in a field of golden wheat was replaced by weariness. Villagers looked at the swaying stalks with mixed emotions, admiration for the soil's fertility, sorrow for the knowledge that so little of it would remain in their hands. Yet even in the collective, there were moments of humanity. Workers shared jokes quietly between rows, offered one another help when backs grew too tired, passed around a jug of water on hot days. Bonds of community, though strained, did not disappear entirely. The soil still bound them together, even as policies tried to pull them apart. The children watched all of this with wide eyes. They saw their parents labor from dawn to dusk. They saw the officials arrive, write notes, and take grain away. They saw the tables at home grow emptier even as the fields grew fuller. And though they were too young to name it, they understood the contradiction. They carried it silently, shaping their memories around the strange reality of abundance that could not be touched. At night, when the workers lay down to rest, the silence was deep. Muscles ached, hands were blistered, but sleep came slowly. Hunger stirred even in exhaustion, whispering in the belly. The fields lay outside in darkness, filled with grain that belonged to others. The barn stood near, echoing with absence. Between them lay the cottages where families dreamed uneasy dreams of bread, of soup, of tables once filled. Life in the collective was not only labor without reward, it was the steady unraveling of meaning. To work had always been to survive. Now to work was to endure, with little promise of relief. The soil remained generous, the people remained diligent, but the bond between effort and sustenance had been severed. And as each day passed, the contradiction grew sharper, the silence heavier, the hunger closer. Part 8. Closed Borders. The hunger that spread through the villages carried with it an instinct that had always guided human beings in times of need, the urge to move, to search, to leave one place in hope of finding relief in another. For centuries, families in Ukraine had traveled when necessary, walking to nearby towns or distant markets, trading grain for salt, eggs for cloth, labor for food. The land was wide, the steppe open, and though life was difficult, movement had always been possible. Now that instinct met a barrier. The borders of the villages and of Ukraine itself were no longer open pathways, but invisible walls. Roads were guarded, trains were watched, and travel permits became as essential as bread. Families who once thought of distant towns as places of refuge now discovered they could not reach them. The land that stretched so vast around them had become a kind of cage. It began quietly, almost unnoticed. A man would set out for the next town, carrying what little he could in hope, in food. He would return empty-handed, telling of checkpoints where guards demanded papers he did not have. A woman might board a train with her child, only to be turned away at the station, her pleas ignored. At first, people assumed these were exceptions, temporary measures, but soon the stories grew more frequent. Whispers confirmed what they feared, movement itself was being restricted. The checkpoints appeared at crossroads and railway stations. Soldiers stood with rifles slung over their shoulders, their eyes scanning travelers, their voices stern. Passes were demanded, documents inspected, carts overturned. Those without papers were sent back. Sometimes they were detained. The message was clear. The countryside was not to flow outward. Hunger was not to spill into the cities or across the borders of Ukraine. It was to remain contained, locked within the villages. Villagers learned to measure their steps carefully. A journey that once took them freely to the next town now became an act of risk. Mothers who tried to walk with children toward markets returned with stories of being stopped, questioned, and sent home. Fathers who attempted to trade in nearby districts found themselves turned away, their goods confiscated. Even the rivers, once crossed by ferries or small boats, were patrolled. their currents no longer free passage, but lines of control. The restriction of movement deepened the silence of the villages. No longer did wagons come and go with the same frequency. The dusty roads once marked by the tracks of horses and wheels grew emptier. The train whistles, which had carried both grain and people across the vast countryside, now seemed more distant, their sound a reminder of journeys forbidden. The world grew smaller, the village horizon closing in like the tightening walls of a room. The emotional weight of these closed borders was as heavy as the physical hunger. To know that food might exist in another place, but that one could not reach it, was a torment that wore on the spirit. The land had always offered escape, through trade, through travel, through the movement of feet across soil. To remove that possibility was to remove hope itself. Families began to feel not only hungry but trapped, their lives confined within invisible lines they could not cross. Conversations at night turned to stories of those who had tried to leave. A neighbor's son had been caught at a railway station and sent back with nothing. A cousin had vanished after attempting to cross into another region, no word ever reaching his family again. These tales were shared in hushed tones with eyes fixed on the floor, the firelight flickering across worried faces. Each story reinforced the same lesson: stay where you are. The risk of leaving was greater than the certainty of hunger at home. The collective farms, meanwhile, continued their work, the overseers indifferent to the plight of the villagers. Grain still left the countryside in wagons, bound for destinations unseen. The irony cut deep. While the villagers were prevented from leaving, their grain traveled freely across borders they themselves could not cross. The soil's gift was mobile, but the people who coaxed it from the earth were not. Even within the villages, movement was watched. Officials noted who traveled, who visited neighbors, who lingered too long in the market square. Suspicion hung in the air, making even small journeys feel dangerous. The freedom to walk across open fields to visit relatives in nearby hamlets, to trade in town, was shrinking day by day. The wide expanse of Ukraine's countryside felt smaller than ever before. Children noticed this change in subtle ways. They asked why they could no longer visit grandparents in another village, why market days were shorter, why travelers came less often down the road. Parents offered vague answers, speaking of sickness or weather, shielding them from the harsher truth. Yet children saw the fear in their parents' eyes when they mentioned leaving, and they understood more than words could tell. The seasons turned, but the restrictions remained. Spring planting was done with weary hands, summer fields shimmered under the sun, autumn brought harvests that once again disappeared into state wagons. The villagers watched the cycle repeat, but the knowledge that they could not leave pressed heavier with each passing year. The soil was fertile, the horizon endless, yet their world had been reduced to a narrow circle of hunger and labor. The silence of closed borders was not only the absence of footsteps on roads, it was the silence of longing, the stillness of trapped lives, the quiet despair of people who knew that somewhere beyond the checkpoints, beyond the guards, food might exist. The thought of it lingered in their minds, as unreachable as a dream. At night, the wind still moved across the fields, carrying the scent of soil, the promise of life hidden beneath. Families lay awake listening to its whisper, wondering what lay beyond the invisible walls around them. The borders had closed not only on their bodies, but on their hope. And in that closure, the famine deepened, no longer only the result of empty barns, but of the refusal to let the hungry seek relief. The land that had once been a cradle of freedom, stretching wide beneath the endless sky, had become a prison. The villagers endured within its walls, their eyes turned inward, their steps confined, their hunger growing. The closed borders sealed not only their fate but their silence, binding them to a tragedy that would unfold with each passing day. Part 9: Silent Villages. Silence had always been a part of village life, but it was never the silence of absence. In the past, the stillness of dawn carried the promise of a new day, broken by the lowing of cattle, the crow of a rooster, or the soft thud of boots on frozen soil. Evening silence was filled with warmth. The muffled laughter of families behind cottage walls, the flicker of songs carried gently from one window to another, the comfort of the world resting after its labors. But now the silence that settled over the villages was of another kind. It was a silence that weighed heavy, a silence born not of rest but of emptiness. The first thing to fade was the sound of animals. Barnyards that once rang with the calls of chickens, the snorts of pigs, and the steady rhythm of cows shifting in their stalls became strangely quiet. Many animals had been seized for the collective. Others had been slaughtered early, their meat consumed quickly when food grew scarce. The survivors grew thin, their cries weaker, until even those cries disappeared. The familiar chorus of village life was gone, leaving behind only the occasional bark of a starving dog or the flutter of a crow circling overhead. Children's voices grew quiet as well. Their laughter, once rising freely across courtyards and fields, diminished into silence. Where games had filled the dusty lanes, tag, chasing hoops, or singing rhymes, there was now stillness. Children remained indoors, too tired to play, their steps slow, their energy drained. When they did emerge, their eyes were solemn, their words few. The absence of play in the streets was one of the most haunting silences of all. The fields, too, lost their music. Once alive with the rhythm of scythes, the shouts of workers, and the songs sung to lighten labor, they now lay strangely hushed. Villagers still bent to their tasks, but the songs were gone. Mouths were too dry, hearts too heavy, bodies too weak. The golden fields swayed in the wind without the counterpoint of human melody, their whispering stalks the only sound. Even the markets grew quieter until they were silent altogether. The square that had once been filled with bargaining, laughter, and the clatter of coins became a place of emptiness. Stalls stood deserted, boards bare, canvas awnings fluttering idly in the wind. The air carried no sense of baked bread, smoked fish, or fresh produce, only the dry smell of dust and emptiness. People still came at first, hoping against hope to find something, but they left quickly, their footsteps soft, their eyes downcast. Eventually fewer and fewer came at all. The silence reached into the homes. Families sat at their tables with little to place upon them. The conversations that once animated meals grew muted. Parents chewed slowly, their eyes fixed on bowls of thin soup. Children asked fewer questions, having learned that their parents had no answers. Grandparents, who once told long stories of the past, grew quiet, their memories too heavy to speak aloud. The lamp flickered, the fire crackled, but the voices that once filled the rooms seemed to have retreated into the shadows. In the evenings, the village streets were almost completely still. A traveler passing through would hear only the creak of a shutter in the wind or the distant howl of a dog. Windows were dark earlier as families conserved their lamp oil. Footsteps that once echoed along dirt paths were rare. Even the church bells, which had long marked time with their steady toll, rang less often. The sound of their absence seemed louder than the sound itself had ever been. This silence was not only physical, but spiritual. It was the quiet of fear, the hush of resignation, the stillness of a people enduring something they could not name aloud. To speak too openly was dangerous. To complain was to risk accusation. To hope aloud was to risk disappointment. So the villagers spoke less, and when they did, their voices were low, their words careful, their eyes scanning the corners of the room to be sure no one was listening. The silence carried into the natural world. Fields where birds once wheeled and sang were emptier. Orchards that had been alive with bees in spring now buzzed less. Even the wind seemed lonelier, its whistle across the steppe no longer softened by the sounds of daily life. The great openness of the Ukrainian landscape, which had always carried voices across long distances, now carried little but the echo of itself. There were moments when the silence was broken, but even these moments carried weight. The sound of a wagon creaking along the road might bring villagers to their windows, their eyes filled with suspicion and curiosity. Was it a neighbor, an official, a requisition squad? The sound of boots on a doorstep could freeze a household into silence. A knock on the door was no longer simply a visitor arriving, but a moment of dread. Even the smallest noises seemed amplified against the backdrop of absence. At night, the silence was deepest. Families lay awake listening to the stillness press against their walls, the faint crackle of a dying fire, the rustle of straw in the loft, the sigh of a restless sleeper. These became the only sounds. Dreams were haunted by memories of livelier times when the silence of night had been filled with comfort rather than unease. Now the quiet felt endless, a heavy shroud that covered every village. The villagers themselves became shadows of their former lives. Faces grew thinner, steps slower, voices softer. They moved through their days as if in a dream, their silence blending with the silence around them. The absence of noise was not merely a lack, but a presence in itself, a presence that weighed on the heart, reminding them with every moment of what had been lost. Silent villages dotted the Ukrainian countryside, each one echoing the same emptiness. From afar, they looked as they always had, cottages clustered together, fields stretching wide, churches rising above rooftops. But to step inside was to feel the absence, to hear the weight of quiet pressing in from every side. The silence was a mirror of the famine itself. Just as hunger gnawed invisibly at the body, the silence gnawed invisibly at the soul. Both worked slowly, both spread steadily, both hollowed out what had once been full. And though the villagers endured, their endurance was muted, hidden beneath layers of silence. In this way, the villages themselves became symbols of absence. Places once alive with sound and life now stood as hushed reminders of what famine could erase without a word. The silence of the villages was not the peace of rest, but the emptiness of survival pared down to its quietest form. It was the hush of voices stilled, the quiet of songs unsung, the silence of a world holding its breath. Part 10. The Weight of Propaganda. Even as the villages grew quieter, the voice of the state grew louder. In cottages where conversations had become whispers, in markets where stalls stood bare, in churches where prayers rose softly, there was another sound that refused to fade. It came from posters pasted to the walls of barns, from newspapers delivered by officials, from radios that crackled in distant towns. It was the voice of propaganda, bright, insistent, unyielding. The slogans spoke of abundance. Bold letters announced the success of collectivization, the triumph of the 5-year plan, the promise of prosperity for all. Posters showed smiling peasants in embroidered shirts standing beside mountains of grain, their arms outstretched toward a radiant sun. Tractors gleamed in the fields, their wheels cutting furrows in dark, fertile earth. Children were drawn plump and laughing, holding loaves of bread as large as their heads. The colors were bright: red banners, golden wheat, blue skies, a painted dream that bore little resemblance to the world outside the villagers' windows. In the newspapers, articles praised record harvests and quoted officials who declared that hunger was a thing of the past. Statistics filled the columns, numbers climbing upward in triumphant tones. Each page seemed to insist that life was improving, that the collective farms were feeding the nation, that the countryside had never been more productive. To read these words while sitting in a cold room with an empty bowl was to feel the crushing weight of contradiction. Meetings were called, even in the smallest villages. Party representatives stood before weary peasants, their voices echoing through drafty schoolhouses. They repeated the slogans, pointed to the posters, waved copies of the newspaper in the air. Their speeches were filled with promises of progress and accusations against those who doubted. If there was hunger, it was not the fault of the state, they said, but the fault of saboteurs, hoarders, enemies within. The blame was shifted from policy to people, from the system to the scapegoats. The villagers listened in silence. Some nodded because they had to. Others stared at the floor, their thoughts hidden. A few repeated the slogans aloud, their voices hollow, hoping only to protect themselves from suspicion. The words filled the air, but they did not fill the stomach. The sound of propaganda was loud, but it rang against the heavy quiet of daily life like a hammer striking an empty bell. Even the schools became vessels of this message. Children copied slogans into their notebooks, drew tractors in the margins, recited poems about the glory of the harvest. Teachers, often as hungry as their pupils, repeated the lessons given to them. The classroom walls were decorated with portraits of leaders, their stern eyes watching over thin faces bent over desks. The children's voices rose in unison to recite the words, though the sound was faint compared to the rumble of their stomachs. Propaganda reached into homes as well. Radios, when available, carried speeches broadcast from distant cities. The crackling voices praised the strength of the people, the abundance of the land, the progress of the collective farms. Families gathered around the faint sound, not out of belief, but out of necessity. To turn away from the state's message was to risk being marked. So they listened, their silence deeper than the words that filled the air. The weight of this propaganda was not only in its presence, but in its contrast to reality. To see a poster of overflowing bread baskets while one's own table was bare was to feel a quiet despair. To hear of record harvests while barns stood empty was to experience a kind of dissonance that gnawed at the spirit as much as hunger gnawed at the body. The louder the state insisted on abundance, the more stark the absence became. Conversations after these meetings or broadcasts were careful. Families spoke in half sentences, in guarded tones, their words chosen with precision. Children were warned not to repeat anything they heard at home when at school. Neighbors measured their trust in one another, knowing that careless words could bring punishment. The propaganda did not only declare abundance, it sowed suspicion, forcing silence into the spaces where truth might have been spoken. And yet, despite its falseness, the propaganda had a power of its own. It demanded performance. Villagers were expected to hang banners, to attend rallies, to cheer when officials arrived. Even as they starved, they were told to smile for parades, to hold aloft symbols of prosperity. The disconnect between body and face, between reality and performance, became another burden to bear. Hunger weakened the body, propaganda weakened the spirit. The churches, too, felt intrusion. Where hymns once rose freely, the voice of the state sought to drown them. Priests were watched, sermons monitored, prayers sometimes interrupted. Yet even in sacred spaces, the posters appeared, reminders of the party's presence, declarations of progress pasted over wooden doors. The bells still rang, but their sound mingled with the slogans shouted from passing trucks. The fields themselves carried the contradiction. Under the wide sky, wheat still grew golden and heavy, but the villagers who bent to harvest it knew it was not for them. The posters declared abundance, and in the fields abundance could be seen, yet at home it could not be touched. The propaganda spoke truth in image, but lied in meaning. The harvest was real, but the hunger was more real still. At night, after the speeches, after the meetings, after the newspapers had been read aloud, the silence returned. Families sat in the glow of weak lamps, their thoughts heavy. The slogans echoed faintly in their minds, but their stomachs spoke louder. The weight of propaganda was not only in the volume of its message, but in its emptiness, the way it filled the air with noise while leaving life untouched. The villagers learned to live under this weight. They nodded when expected, repeated what was required, pasted the posters to their walls. But inside, they carried another truth, the truth of empty tables, of silent villages, of fields that yielded plenty but gave nothing back. The louder the state spoke, the more profound their silence became. In this way, the famine grew not only in the body, but in the mind. Propaganda pressed upon them as surely as hunger did, demanding belief where none was possible, demanding cheer where none could be found. It was a second famine, a famine of truth, and its weight was as heavy as the hunger itself. Part 11. Struggle to Survive. Hunger had become a constant companion, present in every household, every conversation, every dream. It sat at the table during meals, whispering of what was missing. It followed families into the fields, bending their backs lower with each day of work. It lingered in the silence of nights, pressing against ribs, waking children in the darkness with cries that could not be soothed. Yet even in the midst of such absence, life did not vanish completely. There were still acts of survival, small and stubborn, that spoke of the human will to endure. Families learned to stretch what little they had with an ingenuity born of desperation. Flour was mixed with ground weeds, acorns, or bark to create bread that was bitter and hard but still bread. Soup was brewed from cabbage leaves long past their prime, from potato skins, from handfuls of grass gathered along ditches. Mothers stirred these thin mixtures slowly, as though the motion itself might conjure more substance. Fathers pretended to eat more than they did, slipping portions to their children when no one was looking. Neighbors found ways to share even when they had little to give. A spoonful of oil, a handful of beans, a small piece of bread passed from one household to another. These small gifts meant survival for another day. No one had enough, but the act of giving itself carried strength. To know that someone else still cared was a nourishment of its own. In whispered conversations, one family might admit they had hidden a little flour, another that they still had a goat's milk to share. These admissions were risky, but trust, though frayed, was not entirely broken. Foraging became a daily ritual. Children combed the fields for wild grasses or seeds left behind after harvest. Women walked into the forests, gathering mushrooms, berries, or bark to boil into teas. Men cast nets into rivers or fashioned traps for small animals. Though the rivers themselves grew quiet, the forests sparse, the animals fewer with each passing week. Still, the act of searching gave purpose. Each discovery, however small, was celebrated as a victory. Some households clung to secret gardens. Behind cottages or along hidden edges of fields, patches of potatoes, onions, or beets grew quietly, tended with secrecy and care. These gardens were guarded more fiercely than barns, for to lose them was to lose hope. A single potato pulled from the soil, a handful of greens, could mean the difference between despair and endurance. These hidden plots were whispered about but rarely revealed, known only to those who tended them. Faith, too, became a form of survival. Families prayed together in the evenings, their words rising softly in the glow of lamps. Hymns were sung even when voices were weak. Priests, though watched closely by officials, continued to bless the faithful, reminding them that suffering was not eternal, that endurance itself was a kind of grace. The sound of prayer filled the silence left by absent laughter, giving shape to hope even in the darkest days. Memory played its part as well. Elders told stories of times past, of winters survived, of hardships endured. They spoke of plagues, of wars, of invasions, each one overcome. They reminded the young that the soil beneath their feet had seen centuries of suffering and still yielded life. These stories did not fill stomachs, but they steadied hearts. To know that others had endured gave strength to believe they, too, might endure. Children, despite their hunger, carried resilience in their own way. They found games in the smallest things, arranging stones in patterns, chasing shadows in the fading light, humming songs remembered from better times. Their laughter was quieter now, but when it surfaced, it carried a piercing clarity, a reminder of life's persistence. Parents, hearing it, felt both sorrow and determination. The children's joy, fragile as it was, became a reason to keep struggling. The rhythm of daily life adjusted to the famine's demands. Work in the fields continued, though with weakened bodies. Meals were reduced to one a day, sometimes less. Sleep came earlier, conserving lamp oil and energy, though hunger often woke families in the night. Time itself seemed to stretch, each day longer than the last, measured not by clocks but by the slow passage of hunger's shadow. Acts of survival were often quiet, unnoticed by outsiders. A mother saving the last crust for her child, a father walking miles in the night to trade a tool for a handful of grain, a neighbor knocking softly at a door, leaving behind a small bundle without waiting for thanks. These gestures, hidden in the silence of famine, were acts of resistance as powerful as any protest. They spoke of a humanity that refused to vanish, even when everything else was being taken away. The officials continued to speak of abundance, their posters still bright, their speeches still loud, but the villagers measured reality not by slogans, but by the scrape of spoons against empty bowls. In that scrape, they heard the truth. And in their small acts of survival, they carried forward a different kind of truth, that life could persist, however fragile, against the weight of silence and hunger. The struggle to survive was not heroic in the grand sense. It was not marked by great battles or dramatic gestures. It was marked by the quiet endurance of ordinary people, by the refusal to give up even when the odds grew unbearable. Was measured in crusts of bread, in shared bowls of soup, in whispered prayers, in the faint laughter of children who still found reasons to smile. In the stillness of famine, these struggles became the heartbeats of the villages. Slow, faint, but steady, they carried life forward one day at a time. Each act of endurance, however small, was a defiance of silence, a promise that hunger could strip away much, but not everything. The soil still lay beneath their feet, waiting for the day it might feed them again. And until that day came, they endured, surviving in ways both humble and profound. Part 12. Songs and Memories. When the tables were bare and the nights grew long, the people of the Ukrainian countryside turned to something that could not be confiscated, something that could not be locked away in barns or carried off in wagons. They turned to their songs and their memories. In times of hardship, these intangible treasures became nourishment of a different kind. Thin perhaps, unable to fill a stomach, but rich enough to fill the heart with something other than silence. Every village carried within it a well of music, Folk songs had been passed down for centuries, their melodies as familiar as the sound of the wind across the fields. They were sung at weddings, at harvest festivals, at baptisms and funerals. They told of love and labor, of heroes and seasons, of the soil and the sky. Even when the famine dulled voices and stole energy, the songs remained. Mothers still hummed lullabies as they rocked their children, their voices soft, their words carrying comfort even when their arms felt frail. These lullabies were often the same ones their mothers had sung to them, carried across generations like an heirloom. The words spoke of fields in bloom, of rivers flowing, of stars shining above. They promised peace and rest even when the world outside the cottage walls offered little of either. A hungry child, unable to sleep, might close their eyes to the sound of a mother's voice, the melody wrapping around them like a blanket. In those moments, the famine seemed to pause, replaced by the timeless rhythm of song. In the evenings, when families gathered around dim lamps or stoves, stories often followed. Elders told tales of times when the land had been abundant, when bread was so plentiful it seemed to overflow. They spoke of festivals with music and dancing, of harvests that filled barns to bursting. These memories, though painful reminders of contrast, also carried hope. They reminded listeners that the soil beneath their feet was still fertile, that the famine was not the natural order of things, but an interruption in life's cycle. Children, wide-eyed, listened to folk tales of ancient heroes, of tricksters outwitting the powerful, of peasants who triumphed against odds. These stories resonated more deeply than ever, for they mirrored the quiet defiance of survival. To hear of a poor farmer outsmarting a cruel landlord was to believe, even faintly, that suffering could one day be overcome. The stories gave shape to endurance, casting the villagers' silent struggle into the larger frame of their people's history. Songs filled the air on holy days, even if the feast tables were bare. Christmas, Easter, and other sacred times were still marked with hymns, sung softly in cottages or whispered in churches lit by candles. Faith and tradition intertwined with music, carrying people through hours that would otherwise feel unbearable. A hymn sung with trembling voices in the cold carried the same strength as a meal, feeding the soul when the body starved. Even neighbors, when they gathered despite their hunger, often turned to song. A small group might sit together, voices rising faintly in unison. The harmonies, though weak, carried warmth. Each note reminded them that they were not alone, that their suffering was shared, and that unity itself was a form of resistance. Music had always been a communal act, and in the famine it became more vital than ever. Children, too, found ways to keep music alive. They sang simple songs while they foraged for weeds or carried water, their voices light even when their bodies were thin. Their games incorporated rhymes and chants remembered from brighter days. Though their laughter was less frequent, their songs still pierced the silence with flashes of life. Parents, hearing these notes carried on the wind, felt tears rise in their eyes, sorrow for the hunger their children endured, but also gratitude for the spirit that remained unbroken. Memory played as important a role as song. Families clung to recollections of abundance, telling one another about dishes they once prepared, feasts they once shared. Mothers described recipes as though speaking them aloud might summon them back. Borscht rich with beets and sour cream, dumplings filled with potatoes and onions, loaves of bread golden from the oven. The children listened hungrily, their imaginations painting meals that their bellies could not taste. These memories were bittersweet, but they carried a promise. Life had been abundant before, and it could be again. Sometimes the act of remembering itself became ritual. A grandmother might describe the layout of a harvest table from years past, naming each dish in order, blessing each one with her words. A father might recall the sound of fiddles at a wedding, the stamping of feet, the swirling of skirts. These recollections, spoken aloud in the stillness of famine nights, became a way of anchoring the present to the past. They reminded the listeners that their suffering was not the whole of existence, that joy had once filled the same rooms, now shadowed by silence. The church bells, when they rang, seemed to carry memory as well. Their tolls reminded villagers of every christening, wedding, and funeral they had ever attended. The sound linked the present to the long chain of generations before. Even when the bells were muffled or silenced by officials, villagers carried their sound in memory. To recall a bell was to recall the continuity of life. Not all memories were comforting. Some recall times of invasion, of war, of suffering. These stories reminded listeners that hardship was not new, that their ancestors had endured worse and still survived. Though heavy, these memories gave perspective, casting the famine as another chapter in a long and painful history rather than as an end. Even bitter memories could be turned into strength. Through songs and memories, the famine was softened, if only slightly. Hunger still gnawed, silence still pressed, but these intangible treasures filled spaces that food could not. They carried identity, culture, and spirit forward when everything else was being stripped away. In lullabies, folk tales, hymns, and recollections, the villagers found sustenance that no requisition squad could touch. At night, after songs had been sung and stories told, silence returned. But it was no longer the same silence as before. It was layered now with echoes of melody, with the warmth of remembered voices, with the images of feasts long past and dances long gone. The famine could empty barns, but it could not erase the echoes of history. Those echoes lingered, carrying families through the night, whispering that dawn would come, that the soil would one day yield abundance again. The famine hollowed bodies, but songs and memories kept souls from collapsing entirely. They were fragile yet enduring, as much a part of survival as scraps of bread. And though the villages remained quiet, if one listened closely in the stillness, one could hear the faint hum of humanity refusing to disappear. Part 13. The Long Silence. There comes a moment in every hardship when silence ceases to be an interruption and becomes the entire shape of life. By the time the famine reached its height, the quiet that had slowly spread through the villages settled like a blanket so heavy that nothing could lift it. It was no longer simply the hush of hunger or the absence of laughter. It was the silence of places emptied, of voices gone, of lives erased so completely that only the wind remained to tell their story. The cottages still stood, their whitewashed walls cracked, their thatched roofs sagging under the weight of snow or rain. Smoke no longer rose from many chimneys. Doors swung open on their hinges, unattended. Windows, once lit with the glow of lamps, stared blankly into the night. These homes were not abandoned by a choice. They had been left by families who could not endure, by neighbors who had slipped away quietly, by children who no longer came running to the threshold. Paths through the villages grew faint. Where once hundreds of footsteps had pressed the soil into firm tracks, weeds began to grow. Grass crept into streets, roots pushed through cracks. Wagons rolled less often, their wheels no longer cutting grooves into the dust. Even the sound of boots, so heavy in earlier months, was rarer now. The silence was not simply the absence of sound, but the presence of emptiness. Fields that had once rolled golden under the summer sun lay strangely bare. Some were sown half-heartedly, the laborers too weak to finish. Others were left entirely untended, their furrows washed flat by spring rains, their soil lying open and unused. The earth remained fertile, dark and rich beneath the sky, but the human hands that had once coaxed life from it no longer moved in their old rhythm. Where scythes had sung in unison, now only the wind bent the grasses. Churchyards, too, grew quieter. The bells rang less often, until in some villages they ceased altogether. Without the tolling of bells, time itself seemed to lose shape. Days blurred into one another, marked only by the hunger that grew heavier with each sunrise. The absence of bells was perhaps the most haunting silence of all. For centuries, they had been the voice of the village, announcing births, marriages, deaths, and celebrations. Now their silence was the voice of famine. The marketplace, already quiet in earlier months, now stood deserted. Stalls that had once been the heart of community life collapsed under neglect. Wooden frames leaned and fell, canvas awnings shredded by the wind. Dust gathered where coins had once clinked, where vendors had called out their wares. The silence of the market was the silence of an entire community withdrawn into itself, with nothing left to exchange, nothing left to trade. In the evenings, the streets of the villages were darker than ever. No lamps glowed from windows, no songs rose from doorways. The night was filled only with the distant howl of the wind or the occasional cry of animal left wandering. A traveler moving through such a place would feel unease press against them, as if the silence itself were alive, breathing slowly through the abandoned rooms. The people who remained moved with a slowness that mirrored the silence. Their steps were soft, their voices quieter still. They spoke only when necessary, conserving both breath and spirit. Neighbors no longer gathered in groups, for there was nothing to share but sorrow. Families sat together in small clusters, this silence around them larger than the rooms they inhabited. The long silence of famine was not merely external. It sank into the soul. People spoke less, even to themselves, their thoughts heavy, their memories sharper than their present reality. Silence filled the space where songs had once echoed, where stories had once been told. It pressed against the heart, making even the simplest gestures feel weighty. There were entire villages where the silence became absolute. Travelers passed through and found doors swinging, wells untended, fields overgrown. No footsteps greeted them, no voices answered. The silence of these villages was final, like a book closed and left unread. The soil remained, the cottages stood, but the life that had filled them had gone, leaving behind only the faint trace of presence. The silence was broken only by the wind. It swept across the empty fields, rattled loose shutters, whistled through cracks in the walls. It carried dust along the paths where children had once played. It moved across the wide horizon, whispering through the grass like a lament. The wind became the only voice left, speaking in tones both mournful and eternal. Even in this long silence, however, memory lingered. Survivors remembered the sound of laughter, of bells, of music. They carried those sounds within them, replaying them quietly in the mind. A mother might hum a lullaby with lips too dry to sing. A father might remember the clatter of tools in a barn long emptied. A child might whisper the rhyme of a game once played in the lanes. These internal sounds, faint and fragile, kept silence from being absolute. Yet the famine's greatest cruelty was that it made the silence itself seem natural. As months turned into years, the absence of sound became normal. The children who grew during these years came to know villages not by their music, but by their quiet. They learned to walk softly, to speak little, to expect silence as part of life. What had once been a vibrant world filled with voices became, for them, a world of stillness. The long silence was the famine's deepest mark. Grain could be seized, barns emptied, borders closed, but it was the silence that testified most clearly to what had been lost. It was the silence of voices that would not return, of tables that would never again be filled, of songs that remained unsung. And yet, within that silence, life did not vanish entirely. Survivors endured, carrying the memory of sound within them, waiting for the day when the silence would lift. The soil beneath their feet still promised abundance, though it lay untended. The sun still rose over the horizon, though fewer eyes looked up to greet it. The silence was heavy, but it was not eternal. The famine's long silence would one day give way again to sound, to footsteps, to voices, to songs, but for those years the silence defined everything. It was the famine's most haunting echo, the sound of a land where life itself seemed to pause. Part 14. The Faint Return of Life. After so many months of silence, after so many seasons when hope felt like a memory, there came a change so subtle at first that it almost passed unnoticed. It began with the thaw. The snow that had blanketed the steppe melted slowly, streams running through the furrows of fields left untended. The black soil of Ukraine, dark and rich as ever, re-emerged beneath the gray sky. For a moment, it seemed only a reminder of absence, for the soil lay bare, without hands strong enough to work it. But then came the green. Tiny shoots pushed through the softened ground. Grass grew where once crops had failed. Wild flowers appeared in ditches, their colors timid but real. Birds returned, their songs faint but unmistakable. The air itself changed, carrying not the sharp edge of winter, but the softer scent of earth and rain. To step outside in those days was to feel something stirring again, fragile, delicate, but alive. The survivors, those who had endured the famine's long silence, moved slowly at first. Their bodies were still thin, their strength not yet restored, but they looked upon the soil with new eyes. The land, which had seemed so cruel in its abundance stolen away, now seemed again like a promise. Tools were brought out of barns, their handles worn smooth by generations. Horses, thinner than before, but still present, were harnessed once more. The cycle of sowing, interrupted by silence, began again. Families planted what seeds they had managed to save, or what they had been given from neighbors, or what officials finally allowed them to keep. The work was hesitant, the furrows shallower, the effort slower. Yet it was done. To place seed in soil was to make a declaration that life would not vanish, that the future would still exist. Each handful of grain dropped into the ground carried with it the memory of loss and the hope of renewal. The sound of labor returned, faint but steady. Hoes struck the earth, plows cut furrows, voices called softly across fields. There was no singing, not yet, but there was rhythm again, the rhythm of work. Villagers walked the rows together, their steps uncertain but united. For the first time in many months, the silence was broken not by sorrow but by effort, by the sound of hands once more in the soil. The fields responded. The black earth, generous as ever, accepted the seeds and gave them back as green shoots. Wheat began to grow again, stretching upward in fragile blades that trembled in the wind. Potatoes, onions, and beets sprouted in gardens that had been barren. Each new leaf, each tender stalk, was a sign that life could still rise from the devastation. Villagers bent low to watch these plants, their eyes filled with both wonder and sorrow, for they knew how much had been lost, yet also how much remained possible. Children, too, returned to the fields. Their steps were slower, their bodies thinner, but they followed their parents, carrying small baskets or pulling weeds with little hands. They laughed faintly when they found worms in the soil, their voices hesitant but real. To hear a child laugh again in the open air was perhaps the greatest sign of renewal, a sound that seemed almost miraculous after so much silence. The animals returned as well. Chickens scratched at the ground, goats grazed on new grass, cows gave milk again, though in smaller amounts. Dogs, once gaunt, barked with more energy. The barns were not full, but they were no longer completely empty. The presence of animals, the sounds they made, restored a piece of the rhythm of rural life. The marketplace reopened in cautious steps. Stalls appeared again, their offerings modest, a few eggs, a bundle of onions, a small loaf of bread. People came hesitantly, their eyes searching, their hands trembling as they exchanged goods. The sound of coins clinking was faint but unmistakable. For the first time in months, the market carried not only silence but the murmur of voices, the tentative rebirth of community. Memories of the famine still weighed heavily. Survivors spoke little of what had passed. Their voices faltered when asked about the long silence. Instead, they focused on the present, on planting, on tending, on hoping that the harvest would not be taken away. The pain of loss was too great to speak aloud, but the act of working the soil again was itself a form of prayer, a way of honoring those who had gone by refusing to let the land remain barren. The churches rang their bells once more. The sound was cracked in some places, for not all bells had survived, but those that did carried a resonance that shook hearts. To hear the toll of bells after so long was to feel life return in sound as well as sight. Hymns rose in cautious voices, wavering but determined. Faith, like the soil, showed itself resilient, sprouting again where it had seemed crushed. Evenings in the villages changed. Families still gathered around tables, but the bowls were not always empty now. A thin soup contained more vegetables, a loaf of bread was shared among more people. The portions were still small, but the presence of food itself carried hope. Conversations grew longer, memories of better times spoken aloud again, not only in mourning but in expectation. The faint return of life was fragile. Hunger still lingered, the wounds of loss were fresh, the silence not entirely gone. But within the fragility lay strength. The resilience of the soil mirrored the resilience of the people. Both had endured, both now offered renewal. The famine had broken many things, but it had not broken the earth itself, nor the will of those who remained upon it. To walk through the villages in those days was to feel two worlds overlapping, the shadows of what had been lost and the tender shoots of what was beginning again. The air carried sorrow and hope in equal measure. The silence of absence still echoed, but beneath it sounded the faint hum of life returning. The famine's darkest chapter was not yet forgotten, nor could it ever be. But in the furrows of soil, in the laughter of children, in the toll of church bells, there was a reminder that life, however fragile, had not been erased. The faint return of life was not a triumphant ending, but it was a beginning. It was proof that even after the longest silence, the earth could still answer, and people could still endure. Part 15, Remembering the Silent Fields. When the famine began to loosen its grip and the soil once more yielded bread, the silence did not disappear entirely. It lingered in the corners of villages, in the empty spaces at tables, in the memories of those who had survived. The fields grew green again, barns filled with grain, markets reopened, and children laughed in the lanes. Yet beneath the sounds of renewal lay an echo, soft but constant, reminding everyone of what had passed. The silent fields remained in memory. Survivors who bent to plant wheat in spring still remembered the winters when no seed had sprouted, when the soil had seemed like a grave instead of a promise. Mothers who baked bread once more still remembered the years when ovens stood cold, when flour was stretched with bark and weeds. Fathers who watched their children grow strong again still remembered the nights when they had gone to bed hungry. Memory and life walked side by side, each one shaping the other. In many cottages, photographs of those lost were placed on shelves beside icons and candles. Their faces gazed out in quiet testimony, reminders of families that had been whole before the famine broke them apart. Names were spoken softly, sometimes in prayer, sometimes in silence. The act of remembering was itself a ritual, a way of keeping presence alive in absence. The land itself carried memory. The fields, tilled again with plows and tractors, still held the footprints of those who had walked them in hunger. The trees that bordered the roads had watched wagons carry away grain, had seen travelers turn back at checkpoints. The rivers had borne witness to foragers along their banks, searching for weeds to eat. Every furrow, every stone, every bend in the road seemed marked by remembrance, as if the earth itself refused to forget. For the people, memory became both burden and strength. It weighed on them, for the pain was too deep to vanish, but it also steadied them, reminding them of resilience. They had endured what should have been unbearable. They had survived winters of silence, tables stripped bare, villages emptied of song. To carry those memories was to carry proof that life could persist even when nearly erased. The famine also changed the way abundance was understood. Bread, once taken for granted, became sacred. A loaf on the table was no longer merely food, but a symbol of survival. To slice it, to share it, to break it with one's hands was to honor those who had been denied it. Even decades later, survivors would stroke the crust of bread before eating, remembering the times when such a simple gift had seemed unattainable. Songs returned as well, but they were heavier now, their melodies carrying sorrow alongside joy. Folk songs that had once been sung with unrestrained voices were sung more softly, tinged with memory. Hymns in churches rose again, but they carried undertones of lament. Even lullabies held within them a depth of meaning, for mothers who sang remembered the children who had not been soothed in time. Music did not vanish, but it was never the same. It had absorbed the silence and carried it forward in its notes. The younger generations, those who had been too small to remember clearly, grew up listening to these stories. Around stoves in winter, grandparents told them of the years of hunger, of barns emptied by quotas, of borders closed, of villages gone quiet. The children listened with wide eyes, trying to imagine a world without bread, without laughter, without sound. For them, the famine was history, yet it lived vividly in the voices of their elders. These stories became their inheritance, a thread of memory carried into the future. The act of remembering was not always public. For many years, it was carried quietly, whispered from one generation to the next. But even when spoken in low voices, the memories endured. They became part of identity, part of the soil itself. To be Ukrainian was to know the richness of the black earth, the abundance of harvests, but also the silence of famine, the cost of endurance. The silent fields also became teachers. They taught humility, that abundance could vanish, that plenty could turn to nothing. They taught gratitude, that a loaf of bread was not only food, but life itself. And they taught resilience, that even after the deepest silence, the earth could still bloom, and people could still endure. In the end, the famine did not erase Ukraine. It scarred it, it wounded it, it silenced it for a time, but it did not erase it. The soil remained fertile, the people remained steadfast, the culture remained alive in songs, stories, and prayers. The silent fields, once barren, grew golden again. The cottages, once dark, filled once more with light and laughter. The churches, once hushed, rang with bells again. Yet none of it was untouched by memory. The abundance that followed was always shadowed by the famine that came before. The sound of bells was sweeter because of the silence remembered. The taste of bread was richer because of the hunger endured. The laughter of children was more precious because of the quiet that had once replaced it. Remembering the silent fields became an act of honor. To speak of them was to honor the dead, to preserve their voices, to acknowledge the suffering that had been endured. To forget them would be to lose a part of identity, to erase a history written not in ink, but in silence. And so the people remembered. They remembered in stories told at tables, in songs sung at gatherings, in prayers whispered in churches. They remembered in the way they held bread, in the way they planted seeds, in the way they taught their children. The silent fields became part of their story, carried forward not as despair, but as testimony. In the calm of a summer day, when the wheat swayed in the wind, survivors would sometimes pause, listening to the sound of stalks brushing against one another. The whisper of grain in the field sounded almost like voices, faint but steady. To them, it was the echo of those who had gone, the murmuring of memory carried by the land itself. The famine had been a silence. Remembering it was a way of giving that silence a voice. And in that act of remembrance, the people of Ukraine affirmed their resilience, their bond with the soil, and their promise to carry forward the story of what had happened. The silent fields would never be forgotten. They stood as both warning and witness, both grief and strength. They were the land's memory, the people's memory, and now the world's memory. And so the story of famine closed not with silence, but with remembrance. The soil, once barren, grew golden again. The people, once hollow, stood strong again. The fields, once silent, whispered with life. And in that whisper, the memory of suffering and the promise of survival lived together, carried forward forever,